Welcome to Visionaries Global Media, your number one source for podcasting entertainment. Visionaries Global Media, envisioning excellence on a global scale.
Welcome to Nattering E-Trades with Eric Friedlander. What up, world? It's your boy E coming at you from the Nattering with E studios with another episode of the Nattering E-Trades podcast, your number one source for all trades in all the leagues across the world. Whether you're into the NFL, the MLB, NHL, cricket, the Premier League, we'll have you covered for the next several years on different trades. As always, we are sponsored by Visionaries Global Media, your source of excellence on a global scale. You can find this and the rest of the Nattering with E network on both Visionaries podcast channels and our own, where you get your podcasts. For Visionaries, they're on everything. For Nattering with E by itself, we're on Spotify, Podbean, Podchaser, and randomly YouTube has like my own personal page has a YouTube link. So if you're only into YouTube and you're not into like really subscribing to anything else, I can send you that link, or I might actually set up a Nattering with the YouTube page, so therefore I could post the episodes there. Anyways, so I hope you all had a good holiday break. I know mine was both refreshing and partially too long, as I totally missed making new episodes. As someone who's basically relied on podcasts for from a mental health standpoint as like something to do and something to occupy my brain, taking like almost 2 weeks off was a lot to do. Um, so I'm hoping now I'm gonna get this podcast done for this week. Then I'll have a bunch coming up. Like I said, we'll have you covered for Nattering with E-Trades for the next several years. Nattering Bola is going to come back the week of January 7th, and then Nattering Chell should be back actually next week. So that's pretty cool. And then I'll have some stuff I have some stuff kicking in the can for just Nattering with the regular. Like I got a few people who want to come on the pod and shoot the breeze. So I figure those will be those episodes. I'm also looking at doing uh, bringing back the Nattering Nam, the Vietnam War project that I was working on earlier in 2024. That's right, earlier in 2024. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to make sure to wish everybody a very happy holidays, Christmas, Kwanzaa, Hanukkah, whereas Smokey Robinson calls it Chanukah. Um, Also, New Year's is next week, so I hope you guys had a fantastic 2024, and I'm totally looking forward to getting into more podcast adventures with all of you for 2025 and the years to come. So, all right, that's it for all the announcements. But now we'll be getting into our first major sports league and trades that shocked us. So, as we examine some of the trades in league history that shocked us, since there's quite a few, this will be an ongoing series for the next couple of months before we move on to another sports league. Initially, I had this mapped out for NFL, the initial introduction episodes. So, what is a trade? Why do players benefit from a trade? Which were first two you can go back and listen to. Um, and then going after that, my plan was to essentially start with the NFL, go to the NHL, go to the MLB, and so on and so forth. But I was only planning on doing a month for each different league. But now I'm looking at these trades for the NFL alone, and I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna need a couple months. In fact, I'm not saying we're gonna need a year of just doing NFL, but we're gonna need at least 3, 4 months just to cover the NFL, and then we'll go from there. So when it comes to lists, much like a new book, it's important to start at the beginning and see why we should turn the page. So for that reason, today, part one of NFL trades that shocked us slash NFL trades. We're going to start at the beginning. One of the craziest trades that has ever happened in any sport, not just the NFL. And that trade, yes, Minnesota Viking fans, and hell yeah, Dallas Cowboys fans, we're starting with the Herschel Walker trade. Now, I'll be honest, I'm learning just as much as you are while I'm doing these podcasts, so don't take my word as the word of God. There's been a couple of great different resources that I looked at very briefly. Wikipedia, of course, has awesome stuff about this trade. Uh, there was a book called Greatest Team Ever, the Dallas Cowboys Dynasty of the 90s by Norm Hitz, Hitches. By Norm Hitches. If anyone's listening to this who knows how to pronounce that last name, please let me know, and I will update it next week on our next NFL shocking trades. Another thing is 30 for 30, ESPN's great series about crazy things that have happened in sports, did an excellent job on the Herschel Walker trade. I'm actually planning to watch that later to just see how everything broke down and so forth. So those will be the sources for, so mainly our source for today is Wikipedia and like NFL stats and things like that, just to see what happened to all the players. So without further ado, let's get into it. So, as I mentioned before, when it comes to lists, much like a new book, it's important to start at the beginning and see why we should turn the page. Fun sidebar, I actually knew a guy growing up who he would start books at the back of the book and read it backwards to the beginning. And between you and me, I think that's psychopathic behavior, but teach their own, I guess. Anyways, um, the tr so October 12th, 1989, a day our listeners in Minnesota, or just generally as Vikings fans, shout out to our man, Turnbuckle Throwbacks, Phil Rea. Uh, you might remember him from our Lex Express episode that where he basically disproved my theory that Bret Hart destroyed the momentum that Lex Luger had to be a world champion in 1994 WWF. We'll be having Phil on eventually again in 2025, just working on our schedules. Anyways, Phil is a diehard Vikings fan, so I actually went to him to ask him like how things were, uh, like why they would have made such a trade, and he said, you know, at the time, Cowboys were garbage, and getting the best player, like it was a no-brainer because who knows what's going to happen with draft picks essentially. And that's, you know, looking back at these trades, hindsight is always 2020, right? Because you could say now or you could say years later that this is considered one of the worst trades in the history of professional sports, as the Cowboys definitely fleeced the Vikings. However, at the time, Cowboys are going into their fourth consecutive losing season. They've just drafted um, Michael Irvin last in the final year of Tom Landry being the coach in 1988. Um, then they and then finishing 3-13. Then they got the first overall pick in the 1989 draft, and they got Troy Aikman uh, first overall. However, team still finished 1-15. So going um, going into this trade, they essentially new Cowboys head coach Jimmy Johnson had a decision to make. He could tell right away that the Cowboys were not going to be good, and so he was like, "I need to make a big impact." And initially, he had thought, you know, even though we just got him last year, 11th overall, let's trade Michael Irvin. And he was going to trade him. According to Wikipedia, the story goes that he was going to trade him to Oakland. And owner Al Davis at the time said to Jimmy Johnson, "Well, who's Aikman going to throw the ball to if you trade Michael Irvin to us. And yes, that's right. That's right, Raiders fans listening. Al Davis, the original owner of the team, talked the Cowboys out of trading Michael Irvin to you guys. And who knows what could have happened to Oakland, because Oakland was a good team in the 80s and into the 90s as well, but they could have been an excellent team and won more than just one Super Bowl, coincidentally against the Minnesota Vikings in 1983. So our Cal so while the Vikings fans would love for us to forget this trade, the Cowboys fans are probably like, "Hey, tell us more. Please go on with your story." So it was on October 12th, 1989, when the Dallas Cowboys, in the midst of one of their worst seasons in franchise history, decided to deal beloved running back and star Herschel Walker to the Minnesota Vikings for 12 players and no, for 5 players and about 7 draft picks. Uh, Meanwhile, the Vikings would receive Walker and 5 draft picks. So all in all, we ended up having 18 players and picks move in this deal. As you can imagine, with that much player movement, that would alter both franchises. To get to the end, to get to the end, for those that don't want to listen anymore, firstly, how dare you? Secondly, the end result of this trade was that in the 6 year span between 1989, when that mega trade was pulled off, and the end of the 1995 season, when all of the players uh, involved in the deal, including the drafted players, all came into the NFL. The Cowboys won 3 Super Bowls, 1992, 93, and 95, while the Minnesota Vikings came away with almost nothing, as Herschel Walker would end up going back to the Cowboys in about 1995. Imagine that. You trade for a guy and give up basically a ton of your future. And not only does it not come through, but he ends up going back to the team that traded him. Like, what are the odds of that? So, how did we get here? How did we get into this trade? As I mentioned before, Jimmy Johnson needed a win. He needed something positive to happen. He took over for Tom Landry. For those unfamiliar with the Cowboys, Tom Landry is the franchise's biggest head coach. He was the head coach from the start of the Cowboys coming in 1960 um, all the way to 1988 when he was let go. And they'd won several titles with him, but by the end of it, like anything, when you stay too long, it starts to not work. Uh, the 4 games into that 1989 season, after going 0-4 and getting blown out in basically all 4 of those games, in all 4 of those games, we will go and check this out. Okay, so the first game of the season in the 1989 season, Dallas gets destroyed by the New Orleans Saints 28 nothing. Second game of the season is actually a little closer. They lose 21-27 to the Atlanta Falcons. But then they go back to getting obliterated and they lose 30-7 to the Washington Redskins, followed by a 30-13 loss to the uh, New York Giants. Needing to change some momentum because at the time Jimmy Johnson was new to the league and he didn't want to lose his job within the first like month of his tenure. He was out for a jog according to um, Tom Hitz's book, and he decided that something needed to happen, something needed to change. So, as I mentioned before, he initially contacted the Oakland Raiders over trading Michael Irvin, but then after being talked out of that, he figured, well, I need to trade someone else, and who can that be? And his idea was that the person who would give them the most return on a trade would be um, Herschel Walker, who was their star running back at the time. So Herschel Walker, as we later find out, Herschel Walker ends up getting them about 12 players in total. And that goes to show you that like NFL rosters are made up of 53 players. And for one player to essentially get you 12, that's basically a quarter of your team you can alter, which is insane. And so at the time, um, as I mentioned before, Johnson was the next coach after Tom Landry, who, as I mentioned, was the most the most prolonged and winningest coach in Cowboys history. He needed to leave his mark on the so Johnson needed to leave his mark on the team too. As someone with the worst roster in Cowboys history, Johnson knew if he didn't shake things up, either Dallas would be bad for a while or he'd be looking for new work sooner rather than later. That specific season, as we just listed with the first four games where only the Atlanta game was close, but everything else was a blowout, the Cowboys went on to um, go 1-15. They didn't win their first game until week 9, and then they proceeded to lose the rest of the season, missing the playoffs and having to get another high draft pick. Um, this was, as I noted too, this was also the fourth straight year the Cowboys finished with a losing record. Uh, so when one of the questions you might have too is after being with the Cowboys for 28 years, how are they going to pick the next guy to replace Tom Landry? And the reason they picked Jimmy Johnson to be the next guy up was Jimmy Johnson was known as one of the top uh, coaches not in the NFL. So in the NCAA, he coached at the University of Miami for several years, and his record as the head coach at the University of Miami was 44-4. So you're thinking to yourself, young coach, rebuilding team, maybe he can get some success? Maybe. I mean, you start off your first season 1-15, and you know midway through that if you're not making a trade or trying to change up your team for the better, you're not going to last very long. You might even last a couple of years because some of these owners are known for keeping guys way past uh, their expiry. Like the NFL is a bit of a ruthless league in the sense that with both coaches and with players, there's not a lot of leeway for disaster. But on the other hand, if you could turn it around, you can go down as legend. So let's explore that for a minute there. There's not a lot of leeway for disaster. What I mean by that is that there's the NFL season at this time, so the late 1980s into the early 90s, is only about 16 games total with no bye week. So if you're going 1-15, that means that like your season, if you start 0-3, no, 0-2, for instance, your season's done. Even now in 2024 present day, the season is 18 games plus preseason. So if you're not able to turn things around quickly, you're looking for new work. We see it all the time on the player side of things too, where if a person, no, if a kicker misses an easy field goal, then they lose the game. They're usually out of work the next week. Another thing too is if a rookie makes a stupid play and he costs the team the game, he's out of work the next week. Typically, you're thinking to yourself, wow, that is the world's shortest leash. But these guys are treated like spare parts, essentially. Next man up, things like that. Every team wants to win, especially a team like the Cowboys, who had such success in the 60s and 70s, and yeah, 60s and 70s, where the expectation, not only as a fan, but as the owner, is we want to win Super Bowls or bust. Now, if you have four losing seasons in a row, uh, that can't, like I said, uh, the leash is short for someone with a lack of success. Having said that, because the season is so short compared to these other seasons, baseball's 162 games, the NBA and the NHL are 82 games and plus playoffs. If you hit on the right trade, you could turn your whole team around. Or on the other side of things, as we've seen before, and as we've seen before, um, as we've seen throughout history, a trade can also screw up your team. So it's a very risky proposition, but sometimes things have to be done. And so to get back to Jimmy Johnson in 1989, he sees his team. He joins this new team. He's never lost more than four games in his life as a college coach, and now he's already lost the same amount of games over a 6 year span in 4 weeks. So they go 0 and 4. Initially, he decides, I'm going to trade Michael Irvin. He gets talked out of it by another owner who I guess felt sorry for him. I have no idea why they wouldn't have just said yes in Oakland. Um, and then he decides, you know what? We got to make this big trade because who knows what the hell is going to happen. Now, according to Wikipedia, initially it was the Cleveland Browns who had the best offer on the table for Herschel Walker. That that deal initially the Browns offered Dallas a player, a couple of future number one draft picks, and three number two draft picks. So all in all, that would have been about seven players for Herschel Walker. Now, that was actually the best deal they were going to get because all the other teams that were in on them, the New York Giants, the Atlanta Falcons, uh, believed that, Walker wasn't going to re-sign with them once his deal was over. So they weren't comfortable giving such large capital in draft picks and young players to the Cowboys for a rental. Now, other teams you'll see will give up a first round pick or a couple of good young players for a veteran to try and put them over the edge and win in that specific year. That brings us to the Minnesota Vikings because essentially what happened was in o- in order to try and create a little bit, they wanted a little bit more from the Browns, Johnson and Jones, and so they decided, let's contact the Vikings. The Vikings have been close the last couple of years, but they need one more piece, in our opinion, to put them over the hump. The Vikings were trying to make their first Super Bowl since they lost to the aforementioned Minnesota. Sorry, since they lost to the aforementioned Oakland Raiders in 1976. In the previous 2 years to the 1989 season, when the trade had happened, the Vikings had lost to the Washington Redskins in the 1988 NFC Championship game, and then they lost to the San Francisco 49ers in the divisional playoff game in 1989. As a diehard Bengals fan, I mean, I was born in 1988. Little breaking down the fourth wall here, but going back and looking at those seasons, um, those San Francisco 49ers teams were pretty good. We could have beat them, but yeah, the Vikings believe that they needed a little bit more star power in order to get back to Super Bowl. So with that in mind, Mike Lynn, who was the GM of the Vikings at the time, and probably the most hated man in Minnesota after this mammoth trade, decided that Walker was the missing piece to the Super Bowl run. And so he initially was given a deadline of 6:30 by the Cowboys. He faxed in that he was interested, and uh, during the negotiations, in order to get Walker to agree to leave Dallas to go to Minnesota, the Cowboys had to pay him just under $2 million in an exit bonus. What's interesting is that while Mike Lynn will eventually be the most hated man in Minnesota for this trade, he shouldn't be to blame necessarily. What I mean by that is, in the original trade, Dallas agreed to give Dallas agreed to give Herschel Walker and three draft picks to Minnesota. In exchange, the Cowboys would get from the Vikings five players, three draft picks, conditional picks attached to each of those five players should they be cut by Dallas before February 1, 1990. And one of the players that Minnesota had agreed to send to Dallas, Darren Nelson, actually refused to go to the Cowboys, even though he would have been the starter on the Cowboys for a little bit. He didn't want to go to the worst team in the league. So because he wouldn't report to the Cowboys, they dealt him to San Diego for a fifth round pick, which then the Cowboys sent to Minnesota in order to um, get to agree to the Herschel Walker deal. Now, what's interesting about this too is that the Vikings were kind of naive at the time in the sense that they figured, uh, Dallas is going to keep the five players that they sent to them along with the draft picks, and then um, and then avoid the conditions that were being met for the upcoming picks in 1991 and 1992, and yeah. So what were those conditions? Is something that you're probably wondering, and I'm glad you asked. The reason being is that these conditions were kind of ridiculous. The thing is that the conditions for the five players is that should they be cut by Dallas before February 1, 1990, the picks that they had would go from a conditional first round pick, a conditional second round pick, a conditional first round pick in 91, conditional second round pick in, in 91, conditional first round pick in 92, conditional second round pick in 92, and a conditional third round pick in 92 was all based on if the players who had come over, the five players, including Nelson, were cut by the Cowboys. Minnesota's belief was that Dallas wanted to get back into the contending window as soon as possible, and so they believed that the four of the five players that they had kept because Nelson got traded to San Diego, they believed they would just keep those guys and wouldn't cut them. But as it turned out, Johnson and Jones were like, no, 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 we can take our time on this rebuild. Like, it's totally fine. We're in no rush. Maybe we'll just cut these guys and then those conditional picks will turn into actual picks because if we cut all these guys before February 1, 1990, we get all these picks instead of these players. Now, the kicker to this, so essentially what ended up happening was that Johnson uh, told his staff he waived Stewart. Okay, so so the four players that were traded to to Dallas from Minnesota were linebacker Jesse Solomon, linebacker David Howard, cornerback Isaac Holt, and defensive end Alex Stewart, along with running back Darren Nelson. Darren Nelson, we mentioned, was traded to San Diego because he didn't want to play in Dallas, and he was then traded for a fifth round pick that went back. Sorry, that went back to the Minnesota Vikings. So, as I mentioned, Johnson was only interested in the draft picks really, and not those four players because those four players are all starters, and they could have definitely revamped the defense and got them from being 1-15 to maybe a 500 team. You never know. So what ended up happening was Johnson waived Stewart in November of 1989, uh, which meant that Minnesota would then get would then have to give up their third round pick in 1992. He then told his coaches not to start Solomon, Howard, or Holt, which were Solomon was a linebacker, Howard was a linebacker, and Holt was a cornerback. So he told them to make them be backups, and essentially because cut he didn't cut them, but he didn't um yeah, he didn't cut them, but he didn't play them either. So it worked out that eventually Mike Lynn agreed with he made a separate deal that basically said to Dallas, look, keep those three players that you benched and all the conditional picks, and the Cowboys will send you two extra draft picks. So to say that that is not good is an understatement. But one thing that you might wonder before we get there, one thing you might wonder is who was Herschel Walker and why were they willing to give up about 17 overall players for this one guy? So Herschel Walker, yes, that same Herschel Walker, who is now the ambassador to the Bahamas for the Trump administration and won a Heisman at the University of Georgia, uh, is the Herschel Walker we're talking about currently. In spite of being a Heisman Trophy winner, Walker decided he didn't want to go to the NFL initially, and he joined the United States Football League, which was like a one of these side leagues that basically was like, look, we're going to compete with the NFL. And as you know, with the XFL more recently, you're not going to compete with the NFL. It's just not going to happen. And so, uh, Walker initially played for the New Jersey Generals, which was in 1983, which was sort of the appeal to trying to trade him initially to the Giants because he had played in the Meadowlands, which is in New Jersey. So they figured, if we have to convince him to leave Dallas, he'll go to the Giants. However, the Giants weren't willing to budge on any future contract demand talk. He was just like, we can't afford this, dude. Not going to happen. Uh, what ended up happening, actually, fun fact before we get to what ended up happening, is that before the league went bankrupt in the USFL, the New Jersey Generals were sold from an Oklahoma oil tycoon to Donald Trump. That's right. Donald Trump has known Herschel Walker for basically since the 1980s, so well over 40 years. I said so when the W, sorry, so when the USFL ended up folding, the players were made eligible for the 1985 draft, and because the Cowboys knew that Walker wanted to play for them because of their history in the 60s and 70s, they decided, we'll draft this guy, no problem. They drafted him in the fifth round. They took, given his stats and everything, it shocks me to see that he was put in the fifth round because he's basically a franchise Hall of Fame worthy running back going into that draft, and nobody wanted him until the fifth round. It's crazy because he was part of the USFL. I think there was like the NFL's long been seen as an old boys club, and like if you are from another club that is trying to get in, they make it quite difficult for you. So I think there was a little bit of like it was like a turn your nose snooty sort of idea about how like, oh, you think you're better than us, so you play for this other league, and now you want to be in our draft and play for our league. Well, you're going to go in a later round. So he ends up going to the Dallas Cowboys, and he partners with Tony Dorsett, who was the uh, running back at the time. He'd also won a Heisman Trophy, and the idea was, under maybe Landry can get them to work as a 1-2 punch, and they can be like one of the best running back duos in the league. However, as you can imagine with any eventual franchise trade, and the fact that the Cowboys were going nowhere fast in the 1980s, Walker and Dorsett did not like each other because they had to share the ball. Ultim it also came out that Walker was signed to a deal slightly more than Dorsett. Dorsett, I think, was 5 years, 4.5 million, and Walker got 5 years, 5 million. So the difference of like 200,000 bucks was literally what made these guys enemies to each other on the team. Uh, to compromise and make it like more in favor of Dorsett during that 1986 season, Walker played not one, not two, but three positions on offense for the Cowboys during the 86 season, which is insane. He initially started as a fullback, which meant that Dorsett would get the majority of the running back plays, but then when they needed to punch the ball in on the 1 yard line or in the red zone, they go to the fullback, which would then be Walker. They also made Walker the backup running back. So if Dorsett needed rest, the third down back would come in, which is usually the backup running back, and that was Walker. Then they also made him a wide receiver because, as I noted, these Cowboys teams were awful in the 1980s. So they needed players to, if you were talented, it was sort of a curse because you needed these guys to basically play um, as hard, like play multiple positions to try and improve the team. Uh, what ended up happening with Walker, which highlighted his talent, was in week 15 of the 1986 season versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Walker rushed for over 292 yards. 292 yards. Yes, you heard that correctly. And he had both an 84-yard rushing touchdown and 84-yard receiving touchdown. So the talent was there. Dorsett was also a very good running back, but like he wasn't an all-around incredible guy in the same light that Walker was with his talent. Like, as I noted, I'm born at the end of the 80s, 1988, and my friends who are born in the 70s, they always say that their guy growing up in the 90s was Barry Sanders. So I can imagine that people in the 60s growing up in the 80s, um, or like in your teenage and early 20 years in the 80s, were like, no, Herschel Walker was the guy. Uh, because he's a Hall of Famer now, and he put on some incredible um, displays, such as this nearly 300-yard rushing game and an 84-yard receiving touchdown. Like it was insane. Um, so as you can imagine, once he fully established himself there, he got more of the playing time as the main running back for the Cowboys, which then at one point Dorsett was actually healthy scratched for like 3 games in the 87 season. And so he demanded a trade and he went to Denver to play with John Elway. So he went from Troy Aikman to, I don't think he played with Aikman actually. I think whoever was the guy before Aikman, he was his quarterback. Anyways, long story short, he goes from whoever he was playing with in Dallas to Denver, where he played for, I believe, John Elway at the time. So another Hall of Fame level uh, quarterback. And I think Dorsett ends up having a good career. It's just his time in Dallas. Once he left, he was like, you don't really remember him. Anyways, going back to Walker. Walker established himself as the lead running back in Dallas. He has back-to-back Pro Bowl seasons, rushing for over 1,500 yards and 14 touchdowns in each season. And when he was dealt in the trade to the Vikings in 1989, the Cowboys were able to take advantage of his sky high potential by receiving overall 12 players in the trade with Minnesota. Minnesota received Walker along with 4 draft picks, and the Chargers traded a fifth rounder in 1990 for Darren Nelson, as I mentioned before. However, um, as we wind down here, one of the questions that you might be asking is, what did those picks turn into? Which I'm glad you asked. So, Minnesota's first round pick in 1990 was used as part of a deal with the Pittsburgh Steelers to move up from number 21 to number 17 overall in the first round in 90. Number 17 overall was then used to select new running back and future Hall of Famer Emmitt Smith. Minnesota's second round pick in 1990, used as part of a deal to get the San Francisco 49ers' third round pick in 1990. San Francisco's third rounder was then used as part of the deal earlier to move from number 21 to 17 for the Steelers. I mean, for the Cowboys. Minnesota's sixth round pick in 1990, used as part of a deal with the LA Raiders to acquire DB Stan Smalia, um, who's quite good. Then, Minnesota's first round pick in 1991 was used as part of a deal to get the number one overall pick in the 91 draft from the New England Patriots. With the first overall pick, Dallas selected defensive tackle Russell Maryland. Minnesota's second round pick in 1991, used as part of a trade with the Oilers to acquire running back Alonzo Highsmith, who was Emmitt Smith's backup, basically. Minnesota's first round pick in 1992, which was one of the picks that they got um, as part of those conditions with the Minnesota Vikings in the original trade, was used as part of a deal to get New England's first and second round picks, 19 and 37 overall in the 92 draft. 19 overall was then used as part of a deal to get the Atlanta Falcons' first round pick, number 17 overall. 17 was then used to select cornerback Kevin Smith. Not to be confused with Kevin Smith of Clerks fame. Number 37 overall from New England was then taken for Darren Woodson, who was one of the best safeties in the NFL from 92 to 2003. Uh, Minnesota's second round pick, used as part of a deal to acquire two draft picks from the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs picks were used in exchange with the Washington Redskins. With Washington's third round pick, 58 overall, Dallas selected cornerback Clayton Holmes. Minnesota's third round pick in 92 that they uh, was then used as part of the deal to get New England's first and second round picks. So what happened to that essentially allowed the um, Cowboys to rebuild and draft future Hall of Famers, and this also helped them go on to win three Super Bowls. As I noted earlier, in that 6 year span between 1989 and 95, they won Super Bowl 90, they won the Super Bowl in 92, Super Bowl in 93, and Super Bowl in 1995. Meanwhile, what happened to those Viking teams? The Minnesota Vikings in 1989 were eliminated again in the divisional playoffs by the eventual Super Bowl champion San Francisco 49ers for the second consecutive year, also the second consecutive title for the 49ers. Among the four players that the Vikings selected using Dallas's picks from the trade, Mike Jones only spent 2 seasons with the team. Jake Reed spent 8 seasons, and in 1991, the Vikings re-signed Darren Nelson from San Diego, the who was the player who forced Minnesota and Dallas to send him to San Diego, and Nelson backed up Walker for the next couple of seasons. Now Nelson then retired after those seasons. So the picks that um, Minnesota had, Dallas's third round pick in 1990 turned into tight end Mike Jones, who we mentioned only spent 2 seasons there. San Diego's fifth round pick that they had given to Dallas as part of the Nelson deal, who then got flipped to uh, Minnesota, was wide receiver Reggie Thornton. Dallas's 10th round pick, which was given to Minnesota in the original Walker deal, was wide receiver Pat Newman, and Dallas's third round pick in 1991 was wide receiver Jake Reed, who spent the longest time of anyone there. The kicker to all of this is that um, what's his Herschel Walker ends up going back to the uh, Dallas Cowboys and doesn't re-sign with them. Sorry, so the Vikings have not made the Super Bowl since that trade. Even before, they haven't made it since 1983 when they lost to the Oakland Raiders, but particularly people go out of the way to say that it's because of this trade that they haven't gone and made it back to the Super Bowl. I misspoke on Walker just a second ago. What ended up happening was he played only two more seasons with the Vikings, who failed to make the playoffs in both years, a la those early mid 80 Dallas Cowboy teams. He then leaves Minnesota, goes to Philadelphia for the 92 season, and the New York Giants in the 95 season. Then he rejoined the Cowboys in the 96 season. So, on the one hand, not only did this come out as one of the worst trades of all time for the Minnesota Vikings and one of the most bonkers deals for um, the league in general and NFL trades in general, but the end result of this trade was that Dallas got three Super Bowl wins. They end up keeping those four players that they initially benched and cut um, in trade for some better picks. Uh, then they were able to draft. Not only were they able to get those three Super Bowl wins, keep those players and everything, but they also added Hall of Famer Emmitt Smith, Hall of Famer Russell Maryland, Hall of Famer Clayton Holmes, Hall of Famer Kevin Smith, Hall of Famer Darren Woodson. Meanwhile, the Vikings, no Super Bowl appearances, and pretty much just got Jake Reed. So that's why it's considered one of the most lopsided deals in the history of the NFL. Because honestly, at the time, that they the thing that ultimately ended up screwing the Vikings was the fact that Jimmy Johnson uh, made sure to collect all of the draft picks. I think the thought from I don't want to speak for them because I don't know, but my specific take on this is that Minnesota was kind of naive in thinking that here's this terrible franchise in the Cowboys. They don't know what they're doing. They haven't been good in years, and they'll just get the first couple of picks, and then like who knows what'll happen. Meanwhile, we'll get this Hall of Fame caliber running back who he can be the missing piece on our team as we try and get by San Francisco and move on to winning a Super Bowl. And while it didn't work out for Minnesota, I wonder though, if they didn't end up missing, if they didn't get eliminated in the divisional game versus the 49ers in 1989 and then miss the playoffs the next 2 years, do we still look at this as the worst trade in NFL history? Because yes, the Cowboys end up getting three Super Bowls, but it took a couple of years. I mean, they still had to rebuild for a couple of years. There's pros and cons to everything. But anyways, that's this week's episode of trading of Nattering E-Trades. Thanks for coming along for the ride and listening to me ramble on about the NFL and one of the craziest trades in the world. If you'd like to learn more about this specific trade, as I mentioned at the top of the show, you should track down the book Greatest Team Ever, The Dallas Cowboys Dynasty of the 90s by author Norm uh, Hitzges, Hitzges, which looks at this trade in depth and how it changed the franchise's history. The other thing to look for is ESPN's 30 for 30 film, The Great Trade Robbery. The just one more thing before we get out of here. So Jimmy Johnson considered this to be his great trade robbery instead of a great train robbery because of all the draft picks that he had collected in the hall to get um, Herschel Walker. At the time, the reporters were like, "Well, you're going to be rebuilding for the next couple of years, like whatever." And Lynn, the GM for the Vikings, was like, "Hey, uh, yes, we gave up all those draft picks, but like we might win like the next four Super Bowls with Herschel Walker as our missing piece." And I think more or less the reason that this is made fun of so much for Vikings fans is because of how epically it backfired on them. Like if they even go into like a Super Bowl and lose in the next like 4 years after this trade, it's not as bad as what it ended up happening. So I hope you join us next. So this will go when you hear this, this will be up on Saturday, uh, the 28th of December. I hope that you guys have the best next couple of days off while you listen to this, and we'll be back at the start of January with another episode of the Nattering E-Trades, and keep refreshing the channels for more Nattering E, more Nattering with E, more Visionaries Global Media, great shows. And thanks again for nattering with us. This is Eric. See you later.